Humans are wired, and we've been trained very specifically over a very long period of time to recognize a great story arc.
If you want to stand out specifically to the highest people in the company, you need to learn how to package your ideas and tell a story around them.
A clear signal for me that a company is dying is the number of pages in a deck in your average meeting.
You need to figure out how to tell this story on your own and do it in a way that's rooted in the truth and is believable and is interesting.
Welcome back to the Rise Over Run podcast. I'm Doug Barnett. This is my co-founder, Brant Choate.
What's up?
Today, we are going to talk about a single attribute for a whole podcast. Please stay with us. Don't fall asleep. The reason is we believe that this attribute is significantly underrated. It's also often overlooked, and it's a very, very important part of whether you are an investor, a startup employee trying to get a job, trying to found a company, beginning to craft like how you're going to do this. And that attribute is storytelling. So Brant, why is storytelling such an important attribute of career success?
When we're talking to founders and startup employees, it's the number one thing that seems to underpin all of their problems that they're facing and trying to solve, and can't quite wrap their head around why, their pitch isn't resonating or their resume isn't landing in a company.
I think there's like this mystique, some mysteriousness around Y Combinator.
Yeah.
And it's like getting into YC is like this thing. It's like, okay, but what happens when you're in it?
Yeah.
Let me tell you, the first couple weeks, all they do is say, explain your startup in 2 sentences. Explain, okay, that sucked. I can just hear Michael Seibel still. That sucked. That was awful. Why do they pound this into our head? Why is this the very first thing?
Yeah, if you can't elicit some kind of emotion in people, it's hard to cut through the noise. Like, said another way, if you're an investor and you're a great one, you're getting thousands and thousands of decks sent to your email, and they all start to kind of look the same to some degree. They have the same bullet points, the same topics, the same like raw information. And there is no single framework that they can use to go find the winners. And so it does come down to, at some point, eliciting some emotion in them, and the emotions drive a lot of their behavior. Whether they have a meeting with you or not, or decide to invest ultimately, I think that the storytelling leads to the emotions that drive the behavior.
So sticking on the company theme, we were at a Y Combinator reunion event. We were sitting next to, I think Sam Altman was speaking, I want to say.
Yep.
Maybe it was Sam. And during his talk, we were sitting next to this other founder that I think was in, I don't know, it was probably a batch from about 2020.
Yeah.
Sound about right?
Yep.
And his company was not quite to Series A, maybe had a couple $1 million of revenue. Mm-hmm. And we wear these big badges with our names and the company name on them. Started talking to this guy, and he found out that you were at Podium very early on. And he happened to be building in the healthcare space, but specifically selling to small businesses. As soon as he found out you were at Podium, he took his phone and he leans over and he scans your badge with his phone, like takes a picture of your badge. It was one of the most awkward things I've ever seen in a business meeting in my entire life. I think just explain a little bit about why we think he did that.
I've lived in the Bay Area and in Utah off and on, and the cultures between both places are obviously different, politically, all kinds of obvious reasons. But in the startup context, they really split pretty cleanly. It's like engineer, product design focused people in the Bay Area, and then sales kind of, drives everything in Utah for the most part. And the way they typically think is build the best product, and everything else kind of irons out.
Falls downstream of that.
And it's not quite like build it, they will come, but it's, build like a product-led growth strategy, build like a really great sign-up flow, make it easy to like upsell yourself in the product, things that are great and fine and all, but that's like all they do. If you contrast that with how Utah tends to get started on a company, if you're like two salespeople starting a company, you're not building product-led growth. You don't know how to build product-led growth.
Probably never heard of it.
Yeah, but those two people might go door to door with crumble cookies and show up at these places,
Warehouses.
whatever.
Yeah,
And,
facilities.
And the hustle is, and it's not even just hustle. Like I think people in the Bay Area hustle, but it's maybe the shamelessness to a degree to go out and present your product and tell a story and convince people to ultimately buy it. And in the early days of Podium, we had to do a ton of that stuff. We had I don't know if it was a game, but it was kind of like a culture around going to trade shows. And a lot of us would go, like I would go as a product manager, the engineers would go sometimes. And it wasn't good enough for us to go just get a bunch of leads. It was like, no, how do you close them there on the floor? Take the credit card, first time meeting to credit card, paying, swiping, they signed up for a year. So like, what does it take to actually get there? And backing into what we're talking about, it was telling a really good story.
Yeah, and I remember he's like, well, how did you do it?
Yeah.
How did you guys grow? And you kind of did this thing with your hand, like just this.
Yeah.
He's like, literally, you just called people? Like, yeah, we just called and talked to people. Through this lens, the ability to tell a story about your startup to whoever the audience is, whether that be an investor, crafting a deck in such a way, and actually probably the way that I would say this is the deck to an investor and a resume for an employee, presenting themselves to a potential employer. Oftentimes what we see, and a lot of people make these mistakes, is they are so busy telling about themselves, they spend no time selling themselves. That's true for the company, that's true for the employee. And what it results in is a lot of information that unfortunately is super boring.
Yep.
It just is. It's boring. And you have to convince people in such a way that these features that may be super impressive actually benefit them in some way. On the flip side, I'm surrounded by, people in my job that don't enjoy movies. They only like films. Super freaking annoying. In some ways, I think there is some truth here. If you are only focused on benefits, it's all sales, it's all like silver-tongued, it's very little substance, it's failure. But on the flip side, even if you have impressive accomplishments as a company or on your resume, and you don't do anything to help people understand the benefits of what those features are, you fail there as well. And especially at a resume level, that's where I see people failing the most, is here are the bullet points of all the things that are great about me, but they don't really convey a story or a message about how they're gonna make the life easier of your employer or whoever you're talking to.
Yeah, and it's hard to know, what pieces to pull out and what to leave out, and even over time, what people actually care about. And changing this to your audience is hard, always on the fly. But I think if you're applying for jobs, it's a little simpler. Like if we just take our world, you're a software engineer, you're a product manager, whatever, you're kind of applying to similar-ish companies across the board, and the things that they value and care about are also similar. So figuring out a way to pitch yourself and tell a story around your history that elicits some kind of emotion is much better, and I think different than what you normally get. A really standard interview is, let's walk through your job history. What tends to happen, 99% of the time, is just like a reading of bullet points.
Yep.
And the people that figure out a way to, kind of say like, they pull out like one or two tidbits between each thing and weave it together in this narrative about why they're a good fit for your company, really it is the type of thing that you and I will talk about even like months later after we've hired somebody. Yeah. Like, oh, that, like, this person, is memorable because we now have this way to kind of like package and contain their life experience in this like couple sentence narrative, which is really cool.
So let's actually give some tangible advice here about this exact point. A good interviewer is going to dig in on your resume, and they're going to drill. And what that means is they're not going to ask one question about a job or two. They might ask 10 questions. Why are they going to do that, Brant?
For me personally, I'm looking for inconsistencies across the stories. And I think because, like, back to your point about having the substance to back it up, if you've interviewed long enough, you kind of know the things to say. You might even learn like the storytelling part, but the substance needs to be there. And so I'm looking for, them having maybe some cross stories around what they think their strengths are or what they think their weaknesses are, or maybe sometimes their weaknesses are things that they're hiding or are unaware of, and the more that you dig, those things tend to come out in little ways.
Yeah, so if you think about the best stories, whether it's a book or a movie or whatever format that you're interested in, all of them are grounded in a plot. And then there's there's usually problems or villains that happen around it, and they've got to resolve the story. Well, in the very similar way, you as an employee, if someone is digging on your job, what they're trying to figure out is, what was the plot? Who are the characters? What was the problem? What was the conflict that had to resolve? Who was the antagonist? And just like in a poorly written story or a poorly produced movie, if the plot sucks, the story doesn't come together. And that is what someone is digging for when they dig into your resume on a specific job, is like, does the plot make sense? Is the thing that you're telling me about what you accomplished and what you did true? And I'm gonna go dig around in the storytelling to find out if the plot is true. So your ability to really have mastery over your career, what you accomplished, who the players were, getting very specific, honestly, not lying, not fabricating, not embellishing, that happens most of the time. That's all an interviewer is looking for, is the truth, and that the plot is real. Would you agree with that?
I think there's some, I don't know, maybe it's through like the media we consume or whatever, but there's some kind of narrative structures that we're used to consuming, and those can be useful to study, to pull out and figure out how to kind of lace into, presenting yourself, whether that's as an employee. Companies can do the same thing. And I think, yeah, it definitely can help.
Let me give another example on storytelling. So we talked about specifically your resume, how to tell a story about your resume. How can you craft stories about who you are and that you know yourself? Let me give a couple that have stood out to me over the past year or so. Let's say your family is an immigrant family. If you've got a story around how this process of growing up and the challenge of your childhood, etc., crafted you into the person that you are today and gave you very specific attributes, I don't even care what the attributes are. What I'm looking for is, does this person recognize how the story of their life has crafted their skills, their strengths, and their weaknesses? That is a positive signal to me in an interview. So craft a story around your upbringing. Let me tell you mine. My dad was an executive that took several jobs starting in sixth grade, my sixth grade. We moved 3 times before my junior year of high school. So we moved 3 times in 5 years, from Utah to Cleveland to St. Louis to Portland. Not small changes. That change in my formative years gave me the ability to be very adaptable and easy to change, easy to find new relationships, easy to move on. There's also weaknesses that come along with it. But I actually have a story to tell about how my experiences have crafted the things that make me me. That is such a positive signal to have in an interview.
Yeah, versus like the bullet points of what you just said would be like, I'm very adaptable.
Yeah, like
I'm
why?
easy to move on from hard situations.
Yeah, tell me a story.
Okay, cool.
Tell me a story
Yeah.
that proves that that's true.
Yeah,
And make it compelling and make it interesting.
yeah,
And it makes a difference.
yeah. So I think the last grouping of this topic that we also spend a lot of time talking about is how this applies to startup employees. Like you already have a job, you've kind of like won the initial pitch, so to speak, got the job, but you kind of have to think about this ongoing. So when you have a one-on-one with your boss and they say, how are things going? They're kind of like giving you a softball, like, tell me a story. Tell me a story that I'll remember that, you know, makes me sort of believe that you're doing a good job. Because the reality is, like, we can't understand every single thing that they're doing and all the explicit bullet points of what they did in a week, or have some kind of framework that gives them a grade. So their ability to do this, I think, is very important. And I think we've talked about this in a whole bunch of other contexts around some of the differences of why people get promoted versus not. I think this underpins a ton of it. What do you think are some reasons like this really matters for startup employees beyond like maybe just one-on-ones?
One of the pieces that I didn't fully understand until being a founder was the amount of context switching I have to do on a daily basis would be very surprising for most people. And I have to go from one meeting where I'm talking in the details about a very specific set of product roadmaps for our contractors to the next meeting, I got to talk to my board member about our 2025 plan. And they are literally 5 minutes apart. And so back to the substance thing. If someone comes in and they're good at storytelling and they tell me this grand story about this thing that they worked on, and I know that this thing is basically empty calories, I'm going to see right through it. Conversely, if there's real substance behind something, but it's like so technical or so in the weeds, and I don't really understand how it's having an impact on the business, both of those things are negative.
Yep.
But if someone can get in there and clearly articulate, this is the impact this is having on the business, and let me tell you an example of how and why. I was with this customer, or I was with this team, etc., and these are the things that happened because of this. Don't come in and show me a dashboard. Tell me about what the dashboard is doing to move the business forward, as an example. I don't know if people really understand how massively impactful having one of those experiences is to your career.
Yeah, like said another way that's maybe overly honest, even if something's really important that you are presenting to a group of people at a company, they get bored. And if you're talking about like trying to work with the founders, the executives, our tolerance level for boredom is probably the lowest in the company. Like the amount of times I'm sitting in meetings and just walk out because I'm bored is high. And you know, we go try and like remedy the situation there and like give those people feedback so that it's not boring in the future. But that's just like a reality, I think, of.
But when someone is in a meeting or a one-on-one or in Slack and you know the impact and they're doing a great job of communicating it, I'm never bored.
Yep.
It does not matter the topic. It does not matter like how long the meeting goes. If it is an engaging thing that I know is really moving the business forward, it's like the most exciting part of my day. That applies to your job in some way. And if you can get good at it, man, it is massively impactful.
Where are the areas that this can happen? Like one-on-ones, I think, is one. Like meetings, if you're the presenter.
Well, like as an example, let's just take engineering, product design.
Yeah.
We have this channel in Slack that it's called project updates, and people go in and they update in linear what's happening on a project, and I'm not getting in linear on a daily basis. I don't have time and I don't have the ability to span across that much detail. But that Slack channel I'm in, if someone writes an incredible update that's clear and concise and very understandable, it is such a green check for them,
Yeah.
for me. That may seem unfair, but it's just true. The ability to provide an executive update very clearly, articulate it clearly, even if it's off track, even if it's like, oh, we had to delay this, but here's why and there's good reasons. It doesn't always have to be good news. It just needs to be articulated well. That's an example of, I think, an area where something very simple in Slack can be true. Yes, it can be done in one-on-ones. Meetings are tough.
Yep.
You have to be the most concise in meetings, because I hate long meetings. And don't you dare bring a long deck. That is the other one where I see major, like, people make big mistakes here. And this is one of the reasons that drove me from working in a large company, is I would sit in these meetings with 50-page decks. No, we're not doing that. It's just all empty calories, and it's storytelling, but it's manipulative. I'm only going to show you the things that you want to see. And that's not what a leader wants. They want the truth.
It's probably like a hard line to figure out if you're newer in your career, because I think storytelling and manipulation can like maybe blend together in your mind if you haven't found people that do it well. I think about some of the best salespeople I've ever worked with, and they had the ability to tell a story in like the most honest way possible. And it's not this like, we're gonna sugarcoat this thing or like say a thing that's a half truth or whatever that maybe some high performing salespeople get away with. Like the very, very best salespeople
Yep.
are so honest.
Yep.
It does put more onus on honing your story and your actual skills. And so like people don't do it, or they take the easy way out of like telling the half truths or whatever. But I think if you start to pay attention to this, you can see like the very greatest salespeople are like extraordinarily honest. They're very transparent. They're good at even like exposing their own weaknesses as part of selling. And I think that maybe is a way to think about, figuring out the difference here.
Yeah, that's a really important point, because what we are not saying is to craft a message around something that isn't truth. Like, great storytelling is always the truth. It's just a very, very insightful way to describe it. And when you get twisted on this and you begin to like manipulate in your favor, it's the beginning of the end for your career at a company. It will come back to bite you. So we're not advocating for manipulation. We're not advocating for embellishment. What we're advocating for is do the work to understand how your work is making an impact and being able to communicate it concisely.
Here's like an example that actually is very common, especially with younger people. They'll tune into this fact subconsciously, like, I need to tell a story to convince the executives or convince my team. And the story they tell is something like, hey, I went and talked to the whole team. The whole team thinks that we should do X, or the whole team hates this, or so-and-so that is important really hates this. Or like they kind of will take an anecdote and blow it out of proportion. And if those anecdotes are true, they are things that matter, and they think they're like, it's a story worth paying attention to in a sense. But more often than not, the younger employees are actually saying, I care about this, and I actually went and took my opinion and spread it out onto everyone else, and am telling this like almost half truth about reality. And when that happens, it's a pretty quick way to burn trust, because the leaders go and do investigation and ideally don't just take everything at face value and find out that that's not exactly true. So then in the future, when you're like using those sort of rhetorical mechanisms to make your point, question marks go up.
Yep.
Like, is it
This-
everybody?
This gets into the plot of the story.
Yeah.
It has to be believable.
Yep.
And if you are using a single anecdote representative for everyone, it's problematic. And it will, maybe not immediately, it will come back and bite you nearly every time. Okay, hopefully there's been some interesting and also maybe helpful lessons here around storytelling, the ability to really communicate and sell and become a better version of a very honest, feature-driven, high performer, whether that's as a founder or a company builder, an employee, an investor, whatever your role is. This stuff is very, very beneficial. So thanks for spending a couple minutes with us, and we'll see you guys on the flip.